Frugal science, cheap talk or power walk. That's what I want to look at today on Science Spotlight 16. What is frugal science? Dr. Mark Williamson for Transcend. Let's get started. So, an introduction to frugal science comes via the paper Frugal Science Powered by Curiosity, which I found. And it was kind of hard to actually pick out the right term for this phenomenon I'm trying to look at, but frugal science came out as being kind of the term, at least the preeminent term. Well, low cost science is wasn't as good of a term, but frugal science was. So, anyways, let's get into it. So this paper talks about frugal science, which is utilizing curiosity-driven thinking to leverage common everyday items and repurpose them to solve complex problems. So the method is you define underlying physical mechanism, you repurpose common object with the same mechanism with a different design approach, and then there's going to be a transforming of the object into a scientific tool while innovating development with the scientific method. And so frugal science is actually different from related terms, which we'll discuss in this talk. Related terms like free open source hardware and DIY are a little bit different. Um, it does involve things like testing and scientific instruments, but frugal science is particularly curiosity driven. And it's not just about repurposing things, but it's also sort of innovating. And so related concepts, again, like we'll talk about later, is do-it-yourself science, free and open source hardware, even things like GeoGAD innovation or adapted use. And I really like this paper because it actually gave 6 great examples of frugal science. They had the electropen slash e-patch, the paperfuge, the U-pad, the foldoscope, the triboelectric X-ray source, and the bubble wrap container. And so let's unpack each of these in turn. And so here's the first 3. The top left one here is both the electropen and the e-patch. And so for each of these, there's a physical mechanism, the design approach, and then sort of the new frugal scientific innovation. And so in both of these, they essentially took a cheap lighter, which has actually a piezoelectric crystal, and they're able to adapt it to make both an electropen, so that's for creating like electrophoresis to get like DNA into E. coli, into bacteria, and then the E patch, which is I think a similar type approach, though not for electroporation. On the right here, we have the U-pad. So essentially, the physical mechanism is you need, for a lot of samples, you need sample separation, and then use some sort of diagnostic thing for blood, for other detection. And so the idea with the U-pad is combining microfluidics and paper chromatography to actually create a little almost laboratory on a pad. And so that's that. And then one of the most interesting ones, and we'll see in a later adaptation of this, is what's called the paperfuge. So the physical mechanism is centrifugal force in sedimentation for centrifuging down samples. Very common laboratory technique. You need a centrifuge with an electrical circuit powering a rotor. But turns out if there's a toy called Whirligig, which is hand powered and it uses string tension, you can actually use just with a couple handles, some string, and actually paper, and you can actually centrifuge down even red blood cells in blood. And so that was a preeminent example of frugal science. 3 other ones were very interesting here. Top one here is what they call the foldoscope. Essentially, it's a microscope with folding paper, origami, a ball lens, LED light, and battery to sort of replace the traditional microscope, which is great, but very bulky, fairly expensive, circuit powered. One of the most interesting ones was actually this what we'll call the triboelectric X-ray source. So looking at the physical mechanism as a specimen bombarded with X-rays for imaging. So traditional X-ray is certainly good for that, but very expensive and bulky. Turns out if you peel sticky tape, though, it can actually, through tribal charging, can create X-rays enough that even if you kind of set something up enough, you can actually X-ray the bone in your hand. So really fascinating. I think you think of like, well, there's no way you could do an X-ray with such a sort of frugal setup, but turns out you can. And then the final one here is bubble wrap container. So obviously you need sterile controlled volume containers in a lot of lab uses. You have traditional ones like these tubes here, etc. Turns out you could use bubble wrap to mix and have small volumes of different solutions. All right, so that's frugal science. Another review of this comes from the paper in 2018, Frugal Innovation, a Review and Research Agenda. And it frames frugal innovation or frugal science as a resource scarce solution. One of the problems with dealing with the idea of frugal innovation, frugal science, which I ran into, is there's different labels for the same sort of concept or family of concepts in literature. So it's hard to parse out unless you know which terms to look for. And through this review, it has a criteria for defining frugal innovation. There should be one, a substantial cost reduction, two, a concentration of core functionalities, and an optimized performance level. And so, as like a framework that you can apply. But the take home point is that frugal innovation is is kind of a niche topic, and even within the topic, there's a lot of terms that are used for it, so it's hard to actually parse out. Uh, so um, it's definitely a field that is not well defined yet, and so hopefully in the future that grows. Now, I think the big thing is obviously frugal science is all about doing science in a frugal way, innovating, having more people be able to get involved in it, having a lower cost, lower barriers. So it's important to look at what people are actually doing to practice this. So practicing frugal science. So I found two resources of researchers, teams that are actually practicing frugal science. First one is Bio E271, Frugal Science. That's a course here out of Stanford by Dr. Manu Prakash. In fact, when you type frugal science, in search, you'll mostly his name and his work will pop up, whether it's interviews, YouTube videos. So he's kind of the face of frugal science as the specific keyword. But you can go to frugalscience.org and you can get lectures and more importantly, projects from 2020 all the way to 2026. Science Sans 2022, there wasn't ones for that year. Another resource would be Frugal Science Academy, and that's Dr. Saeed Bamla, I believe. He's from Georgia Tech, and he's actually one of the authors of that paper we first looked at, the Frugal Science Powered by Curiosity. There is a website, though it's not entirely sure if it's currently running. 2024 had the latest info. But the tagline at the website is that at Frugal Science Academy, we help high school students build synthetic biology tools using everyday objects. So Frugal Science, that's more for university students, whereas Frugal Science Academy is more for the high school students. And now for each of these, now in Frugal Science, again, there's a lot of great projects. And for most of the projects, there'll be a YouTube video that has the student projects presenting those projects. So I look through the different years and I come up with ones I think were the most interesting, had the most potential. So there is Space Popcorn in 2020, which was an origami-inspired way to capture space debris in a more cost-effective manner. There was Soil Lab, which was a frugal soil quality test kit for farmers. There's Recycle Pi, using old smartphones as a replacement for the Raspberry Pi. There was 1 cup of coffee, coffee waste as a biomaterial for, creating, biomaterials, including mixes with other things. And then there was Lab X, a physics laboratory experiment kit. So one of the ideas was having a friction demonstration with some of the materials and then found materials as well. Other ones were EcoCool, a low-cost cooling technology. It was essentially a 3D printed fan blade and our Arduino setup. Electricity-free PCR thermal cycler, which actually was a thermocycle that works on the principle of oscillating systems. So one of the ideas was like, well, the Drinking Bird toy kind of mechanism, because maybe that could be adapted. That same underlying physical mechanism could be used as a passable thermal cycler. And there is sharps removal, frugal low-tech high throughput needle destruction, air purification, so a frugal air purification system, and finally low-cost tent, so a heat relief shelter that kind of dealt with paper and origami. Over on the Frugal Science Academy side, again, this was that one of the authors of the Frugal Science Powered by Curiosity, where we saw those 6 examples. So the 3 ones they had up there is OpenCell. So it's an economic open source 3-in-1 laboratory device that combines a bead homogenizer, a microcentrifuge, and a vortex mixture. You can see there's 3D printed parts here. There's the electropen. We saw that already. It's a 23-cent electroporator or electropen to deliver DNA into E. coli cells. You can see examples here. And then the 3D fuge, which is actually building on the paper fuge we saw before, 3D printed version that enables larger volumes for synthetic biology applications. So those are all really interesting applications of frugal science. All right, so really, other than those papers, those resources, I wasn't really able to find much other useful resources for frugal science but allied concepts that sort of take the same thing but are named different things are in the literature. And so I want to cover 3 main ones that complement frugal science. The first one is DIY or do-it-yourself science. Then there's also free open source hardware. And then finally, citizen science. So DIY science, well, what is that? A good article getting into that is the 2020 article, Do-It-Yourself Science, the Proliferation, Relevance, and Concerns. So DIY science essentially is scientific activities outside traditional institutions, so outside academia or scientific labs. And it's by nature sort of interdisciplinary, cost efficient, and open source, so overlapping a lot with the idea of frugal science. Though, however, it doesn't stand on its own. It certainly benefits from technological innovation started in the institutions. And other related terms that go into DIY science, again, showing the heterogeneity of terms, making it hard to really research this initially. Related terms is open science, citizen science, making, hacking / tinkering, so maker spaces, hacker spaces, etc. Even things like kitchen biology or garage biology are related terms. And now, how we contrast this with, say, something like citizen science. So citizen scientists contribute to work, but the citizen scientists don't actually instigate. However, DIY scientists contribute and are typically the ones who instigate the work. And some great examples in this paper on DIY science is a private home laboratory, something called the Night Scout Project, which is a remote monitoring of glucose levels. There's the Katie Wino instrument, which was for water cycle visualization, glow-in-the-dark yogurt using bacteria, and just general concepts like Arduino or even Linux, which is the most used operating system ever. It wasn't developed in a university. It was developed by Linus Torvalds in his Swedish apartment. Now, one of the things that DIY science runs into is safety concerns. If you're doing sort of these things, especially biology outside of the traditional institutions, especially with things like synthetic biology or just biosecurity or even DIY medicine. It's certainly something that needs to be considered, though the paper goes over that some of those safety concerns are probably overblown, but certainly still important. Useful resources. And this paper here is sort of the landscape of open science, from institutional science to DIY, maker movement, citizen science. And it does have a good appendix on seminal papers on DIY science if you want to explore further. Published in anywhere from Nature, JAMA, down to things like bioessays, plus biology, etc. All right, another good paper on DIY science is called Do-It-Yourself Laboratories and Science, Technology, Innovation, STI, Trends, Implications, and Future Research. This is in 2021. It was a systematic DIY literature review from 1990 to 2019. And one of the big takeaways is contrary to the image of the backyard amateur doing DIY science, most DIY activities were actually carried out by semi-professionals operating from traditional research laboratories. So it was not so much alternative, but parallel to sort of traditional science. The paper talked about three waves of DIY activities, starting in subsistence to industrialization, then finally innovation, technology, and entrepreneurship, sort of the frontiers, rather than sort of just making do or trying to shift gears into industrializing. And one of the 2 points about DIY science that probably are underestimated when you think about it, it's not just about saving money or doing things outside of the mainstream, is actually just enjoyment and self-efficacy of DIY scientists. Be able to the enjoyment, the pleasure of being able to do it yourself. And with this sort of review, they found that most studies were in actually developed economies. While you think of do-it-yourself or frugal science is really helpful for developing countries, most studies are still done in developed economies, in developed nations. Most studies were conceptual or single case study and design, so we're not very far along in complexity. And many do not have a specific purpose or specific funding. In fact, a quarter were self-funded. There were a smattering of different subject areas, but most were either mixed focus or biological in nature, which kind of makes sense. See a lot of the biology, even with the Frugal Science Academy, it was synthetic biology focused. All right, and then another article here in 2012 called Build Your Own Lab, Do-It-Yourself Biology and the Rise of Citizen Biotech Economies. And it really looked at the material aspects of DIY biology, so the locations, equipments, and objects, and talked about different methods of DIY science that may be informative, talking about webcam to microscope conversion, open PCR, and lava amp as alternatives to regular PCR, open gel box for gel electrophoresis, or even alternative DNA purification. And the three site examples in this paper were first La Palais. It was a community laboratory with two spaces, an open space and more regular spaces. It's in Paris. There's also Kay All's private apartment lab. She was able to create for about $1,000 a lab in her closet in her apartment. She had like a rice cooker to distill water. She had an incubator made for a polystyrene box, a thermostat, a fan, and a heating pad, and a thermometer. And she even had an electrified box for DNA separation, kind of showing the frugal innovation to create her own little lab. And then finally, there's the Dremel Fuge, not so much a location, but an example of a device. So this was a device created by Cathal Garvey to be attached to a power drill or rotary drill for centrifuging tubes. So very much in line with the paper fuge, though more along the same sort of physical mechanism as a centrifuge, but using a different, using a drill rather than a plug-in, a rotor. And a really important resource that came out of this was this website, diybio.org. And so here's just an example actually on, I think, Thingiverse. Thingiverse, about the Dremel feature. You actually 3D print this piece. There's a couple different, I think, versions for depending on which rotary tool you're doing, but this is the Dremel fuge. All right, so another related concept is free open source hardware. So a good article on this is Building Research Equipment with Free Open Source Hardware. This was in 2012. And so in the past, one of the useful innovations with science was free and open source software, which is a lot easier to develop and modify. However, in the present even in 2012, the addition of free and open source hardware has really been changing the game, a paradigm shift. And big examples with that would be Arduino. Um, and we'll look more on Arduino in the future, but even just hardware based on the Arduino is like things like the Arduino Geiger, which for radiation detection, the pH Arduino, a pH meter, Zoskilo, a oscilloscope, or even OpenPCR for DNA analysis. And of course, another really fundamental free and open source hardware would be 3D printing, whether it's the RepRap, one of the most popular fabrication tools because it's a partially self-replication rapid prototyping machine. So it's a 3D printer that can 3D print some of its own parts to go. And then there's Thingiverse. So that's a repository for files for physical objects in things like lab research. And so you can actually print and make full open source scientific hardware. And so if you take 3D printed parts and microcontrollers like Arduino, you can have full open source scientific equipment. So some examples, like you can make simple things like vial racks, booster funnels, microtiter plates. So different the different thing IDs from Thingiverse. You even have an open source orbital shaker used for mammalian cell and tissue culture and benchtop science. And so that's combining both. Sort of the best example of combining both to have a really cost-effective way to have this hardware. And you can have things like customizable automated filter wheels or even microfluidic lab on a chip architectures, because one of the nice things with 3D printing is you can sort of design pathways. However, you know, with anything, there's trade-offs. There's certainly limitations on what you can design and what sort of longevity you can get out of free open source hardware. So there will always be trade-offs. Another useful article on free open source hardware is open source hardware is a low cost alternative for scientific instrumentation research, 2012. Again, there's a trade-off in things like data collection. So manual data collection is slow and labor intensive, but cost effective. Automated is quick and low labor, but can be very costly, especially with electric instrumentation. Now, a paradigm shift is now we have fairly inexpensive and customizable microcontrollers. So that's small, low-cost computers on a single chip. The most notable, which we'll see, is Arduino. And then we also have open source software to run that hardware. So now we don't, there's not as much of a trade-off we need to make anymore that we actually can do automated in a fairly cost-effective way. So Arduino is really the main one here and its successors or similar. So essentially what Arduino is a programmable microcontroller mounted on a circuit board with input and output pins. And it can connect to computers, so you can write software and put it on there to run it. You can also include what's called shields. So those are standardized add-on boards. You can plug into your Arduino to do more. And you can program with Arduino IDE, integrated development environment. And there's a lot of different sensors sort of you can use, whether it's temperature, soil water status, distance, pressure, time, data storage, all sorts of things. And this article talks about three real practical examples of using Arduinos and sensors to be able to data collect. So they talked about a soil moisture monitoring data logger, an ultrasonic water level data logger, and an environmental data logger. And here's some examples here of different Arduinos. So there's the modified one, kind of showing generally what they look like. A shield, modified shield, even one here that kind of shows sort of the circuit design, the back, and then like the front or front and back, however you want to just determine that. Some really useful tables. So table one shows the list of materials for that soil moisture sensor data logger. So the components, parts number, supplier, and actually the total cost. And it's pretty crazy. You can, for about, $44, you can get a data logger. And for the environmental data loggers, for more general one, it only costs $26 with all the parts. So if you can put it all together, you can code it, get the code to run it. That's very, very cost effective. All right, and then the final related term is citizen science, and I pulled this article in 2018, 10 Principles of Citizen Science, to sort of parse out what it really means to do citizen science. And this article, these principles were developed by an international community of citizen science practitioners and researchers. And you can see the full text of each of the principles. I try to distill them down in the 10 that I show here. So these aren't verbatim, these are my distillations. So first of all, citizen scientists are actively involved in real science. So they're not just busy work, they do real science. And the projects that they are involved in have genuine science outcomes. And that working together, professional scientists and citizen scientists both benefits. It's not just the professional scientists sort of taking advantage of citizen scientists or something like that. They actually both benefit. And that citizen scientists aren't just relegated to, say, data collection, et cetera. They actually can participate in multiple stages of the process. And that they'll receive feedback, and that the research approach is actually the same as standard science projects. It's not sort of watered down, it's not easy peasy. It's as rigorous as a typical scientific project. And because it's sort of citizen science, more open, the project data should be made publicly available when possible. Sometimes that's not always possible, but that's sort of more baked into it than maybe a traditional science project. Not that traditional projects don't have publicly available data at times. Eighth one, citizen science are acknowledged in results and publications, so they are a real part of it. They are really acknowledged. And the project is elevated like a normal project with output and quality, but also something that maybe is above and beyond the typical science project, which is social impact. And finally, project leaders, because this is dealing with a little bit more complicated social and ethical and even legal issues, that the project leaders are going to consider those legal, ethical, etc. issues. All right, so with that, we talked about these ally project, DIY science, um, citizen science, free and open hardware, open source hardware, and even just frugal science. It's good to explore sort of what's available, what sort of the spaces are. So we'll look at that one resource, DIY Bio. We'll also look at the Frugal Science Challenge on experiment.com, where you can see real funded research on frugal science. Look at SciStarter and as well as Zooniverse. So we'll transition here and I'll just look live at the websites. All right, so the first one here is the DIY Biosphere. And so it's an open source project to connect DIY bio initiatives worldwide. And so you can search a variety of things. So there's the big one would be projects. So that have particular aims. See if it will actually load. Okay, so it doesn't look like that's working. It was working a little bit better earlier. But there we go. Okay, here's some lab. So there's some stuff with the labs. Again, I don't know how active these things are. A lot of these seem to be older. Again, some of the actual projects, which I think would be the more interesting ones, aren't loading right now. Okay. All right, going back here, looks like there is also looks like there's some internet problems on my side. I did get some of the DIY Biosphere to load. There are about 9 projects whether they're still active. I mean, they say they're active, but not quite sure. There's more just collections of articles. There's BioArtBot, the Decentralized Oxalis Genome Project, Kombucha Genomics. So some of these things might be of interest to you, or you could use this to sort of develop your own projects and grow. Again, maybe your mileage will vary. I don't know how active some of these groups are, but there at least are attempts at connecting DIY bio worldwide. Next up is this isn't so much of a active thing, current thing you can do, but sort of a showcase of past things. So this is again that Frugal Science. These were actually experiment challenge on experiment.com. Experiment.com is sort of like Kickstarter, but for science experiments. You can actually get crowdfunding. And so this was a specifically supported one out of the Prakash lab. And these were actually funded projects. And this is really interesting to see projects that were actually funded even up to like $10,000. So, like a universal, frugal, and antibiotic-free sugar selection system for molecular cloning, a low-cost autonomy bag that won't leak, low-cost vacuum pump to make electron microscope accessible to kids, anywhere from maybe over 10,000 to even like 5,000, even lower than that. One was even just a little over 1,000. So a range of different funded frugal science projects. All right, the last two are more in the citizen science. There's Universe. It's the world's largest platform for people-powered research, so citizen science. And the thing I wanted to showcase here is it's really helpful for both participants. If you want to be a citizen scientist, you can find projects that are interesting. But as a researcher, what I really like is you actually build your project and submit it for approval and launch it. And there's a lot of projects you can explore. It looks like there's a sort of app forward. We'll see if we can get this to load. Fortunately, it looks like it's my internet that's slow, but there's things like Galaxy Zoo looking at machine predictions to reveal the shape of stellar nursery, marine lens, help marine biologists identify real reef life in the Florida Keys. There is comet catchers, cameras for conservation, etc. And there's different organizations. And then maybe a little more popular or more public-facing one is SciStarter. That's citizen science, and there's going to be some overlap between this and Zooniverse. But the one thing I noticed with SciStarter, it seems is more for the citizen scientists and less for the researchers who want to sort of involve citizen scientists. So I'd say Zooniverse if you're a scientist who wants to get people involved. SciStar if you're a citizen who wants to get involved in science. There's a lot of project finding, and I really like the fact that there are training modules for citizen science. All right, so how do we summarize frugal science? So first of all, we should talk about who is it for? So frugal science, DIY science, and those related terms, therefore, essentially would be for really helpful and beneficial for the developing world that we see that's not most still takes place in the developed world. And certainly can be helpful for young scientists. We saw some of these initiatives like the Frugal Science Academy for high school students or even for university students with the Frugal Science course at Stanford. Certainly can be helpful for students, educators, and even just totally independent scientists. And for people who maybe not strictly scientists, but are tinkerers or people who are interested in citizen science, something like frugal science could really be a benefit. Some conceptual tools that seem to come out of frugal science is first principles thinking, thinking how things work at a fundamental level, the mechanisms, and then applying creative thinking from there, or even things like reverse thinking, starting with an end product and trying to like reverse engineer it and how to get there from maybe a different angle. And comes down to things like tinkering, making, hacking, taking things apart and trying to do things better, do things differently. And finally, benchmarking, making sure what you actually innovate on can do what you want to do maybe not as well as the more standard methods, but well enough to get what you want done. And some really powerful physical tools for this, or I don't know if you say digital tools as well, would be 3D printing. That's a huge boon to this. Software, open source software, and then of course open source hardware, like things like Arduino and other things like that. So again, there's a lot of different terms. We talked about frugal science, we talked about the allied terms, and so I wanted to create this Venn diagram that really helps bring together different concepts and which ones exemplify them. So three big points would be the cost savings, scientific advances, and expanded participants, getting more people involved. And so when he comes up with these different terms, where do they fall? I would say something like DIY science falls in sort of the intersection between cost savings and scientific advances. DIY science, as we've seen, is more parallel to traditional science. It's a lot of semi-professionals or semi-professionals working sort of in parallel to traditional science. So it's a lot about cost savings, doing things more frugally, more efficiently, but trying to make real scientific advances. In the intersection between scientific advances and expanded participants is citizen science. You're still doing real science, trying to make more advances in science, but expanding who can get involved, more of the citizen side of things. Not that there aren't cost savings here too, but I think that the expanded participants and scientific advances are the two main ones. Then on the third intersection of the two, of cost savings and expanded participation, is more like the tinkering and hacking, where you're not so much interested in strongly scientific advances, but more people being involved in that tinkering side of thing, the hacking side of thing, and then of course doing it more cost effectively, saving costs. Whereas the intersection of all three is where I'd say probably the frugal science comes in. More people can get involved. It's significant cost savings, but making real scientific innovation, scientific advances. All right, with that, we'll close out here. Here are the references that I worked through here, so you can take a look at yourself. And in closing, thanks for joining me. I'd love to hear your comments on this talk, and I'd love to hear what topic I should cover next. I'm Dr. Mark Williamson for Transcend. Thanks for joining me for Science Spotlight. I'll see you next time.